Picture a photograph of yourself as a newborn, held in your mother's arms. Now picture the photo behind it. Your mother as a newborn, held by hers. Behind that, another. You're building a stack. Every card a baby, every baby cradled by the one who came before, the whole thing reaching backward out of your hands, out of the room, out of the century. Keep laying them down. Past the grandmothers you have names for, past the ones you don't, past the faces no camera ever caught. The fashions dissolve, then the cities, then the language itself. Somewhere deep in the pile, the babies are being born in caves, then under no shelter at all, and the hands holding them are getting hairier, the brows heavier, the bodies shorter and stranger, and still, on every single card, you are looking at a parent holding its own child. That's the one rule we're going to lean on tonight, and it never breaks. Each baby in that stack is exactly the same kind of creature as the arms holding it. Now do the thing your brain is already itching to do. Walk along the stack and find the first human, the original. Card number 1 of us, the one before which there were only animals and after which there were people. Go ahead, point to it, watch what happens when you try. You pick a card that looks convincingly human and flip to the one behind it, the parent, and it looks basically the same. Of course it does. It's the mother. So that can't be your line. A human came out of her, which makes her human too. Fine. You slide back another card, same problem, and another. Each mother sits so close to her child that calling her not one of us while her baby is one of us feels deranged, because it is. You can run this for 10 cards or 10,000, and the verdict never shifts. The parent is always the same species as the child in its arms. We're not built to think this way because we live drowning in sharp lines. Your phone sorts your life into tidy folders. A birthday flips you from 12 to 13 at a precise second. There's a date you became an adult on paper, a line on a map where one country stops and the next starts. We expect the world to arrive with edges, so when somebody says the word human, we picture a starting whistle, a first one, a moment, a threshold that someone stepped across while the rest of the herd stayed behind. And the quietly vertiginous truth, the whole reason we're spending this time together, is that the threshold isn't merely hard to find. It was never there to cross. There was no first human. Not because the record's burned, not because the right fossil is still buried in some hillside waiting for a shovel. There couldn't have been one, even in principle. Every creature in that stack was the same species as its parents and the same species as its children. The change is absolutely real. The two ends of the stack are wildly different animals, but it arrives too slowly to ever finish on a single birthday. Nobody was born across the line, because the line is something we paint on afterward. I know exactly how that sits, because part of you wants to push back, the same way it wants to insist there must be a tallest short man or a final cold day of winter. Surely if you walk back far enough, you hit a moment, a first. And I promise you, the deeper we go, the stranger this gets. Because that stack doesn't politely halt at the cave dwellers. Keep dealing cards, and the creatures shrink and scatter and crawl back toward the water. Run it far enough, and one of those baby photos is a fish, a literal one. Somewhere on your direct line, no metaphor involved, a fish produced something it regarded as entirely its own kind, and it was right. Every parent in that absurdly long line was the same species as its kid. The fish was a fish having a fish. You are a human having a human. And between those two facts, there is no card where it flips, no birthday where some almost creature delivered a brand new other creature and the room gasped. Print that stack for real, one photo per generation, all the way back to the fish, and you wouldn't be holding a pile. You'd be facing a column you could walk beside for the length of a long afternoon and never reach a single page where the animal in the picture suddenly changes. It only ever drifts. Frame by frame, too gently to catch in the act, the way you can't watch your own face age in the bathroom mirror, yet there's a stranger looking back at you from photos a decade old. So the obvious question, the very first one each of us reaches for, who was the first human? He turns out to be a door painted on a wall. It looks like something you could walk through. There is nothing on the other side, which drops us into a real and awkward problem. Because scientists absolutely do use the word human. They draw the line, they print it in the textbooks, they'll tell you our species runs some hundreds of thousands of years deep. If there's no card where it flips, if every parent matches its child the whole way down, then what exactly are they pointing at when they say the word at all? So hold that question where you can see it, because the way out runs straight through a second one. What does a biologist actually mean by the word species in the first place? The cleanest answer we have is roughly 80 years old, and it belongs to a German-born biologist named Ernst Mayr. His idea, the biological species concept, is disarmingly simple. A species isn't a shape or a checklist of features. It's a club defined by who can breed with whom. Members of one species can mate and produce fertile offspring together and can't with outsiders. The boundary isn't drawn around a body. It's drawn around a breeding population. Mayr didn't dream this up at a desk. In the late 1920s, he was a young man tramping through the mountains of New Guinea, collecting birds for months on end, and what he found out there stuck with him. Climb from one valley to the next, and the birds shaded into one another. A little more color here, a slightly different song there, until the labels in the field guide stopped meaning much. Where the books promised crisp species, the living forest handed him a smear. The lesson he drew wasn't to squint harder at feathers, it was to ask a different question altogether. Never mind how they look. Who actually breeds with whom? Take that definition seriously, and the mechanism clicks into place because it quietly tells you how a new species is born. It never is, not in the way the word born suggests. New species don't arrive in a delivery room. They form when one population gets cut in two, a river shifts, a desert spreads, a few stragglers wash up on an island, and the two halves stop trading partners. Generation after generation, each side drifts on its own. The drift is tiny every time. But give it long enough, and the two groups can no longer interbreed even if you push them back together. Only then, looking back, do we say a new species exists. Speciation is something that happens to a population across deep time. It is never an event that happens to one baby on one afternoon. That is the real reason a mother and her child are always the same kind of creature. The child isn't a reproductive island. It's one half step inside a population still perfectly able to breed with the world it was born into. You cannot be a different species from the people you could have children with, and the first people you could ever have children with belong to your own parents' generation. You might push back here, and you should, because it sounds like a loophole. Babies are sometimes born carrying brand new mutations their parents never had. Doesn't that make them, in some tiny way, a different thing? It does make them different. It does not make them a different species. A fresh mutation is one altered letter in a 3 billion letter book. Reproductive isolation is a wall, and walls don't go up by laying a single brick in the dark. The wall between two species gets built by thousands of generations, stacking change on change until the two populations simply can't mix anymore. No single birth has ever finished that wall. Which drops us onto a piece of logic that philosophers have chewed on for 2,500 years. They call it the paradox of the heap. Take a heap of sand and remove one grain. Still a heap. Remove another. Still a heap. There is never a single grain whose removal flips a heap into a not heap, and yet keep going, and the heap is plainly gone. Pour that same logic into our photo stack, and it turns airtight. The father of a human is a human. The son of a non-human is a non-human. Both sentences are undeniably true on every card in the pile. Lay them side by side, and they snap shut like a trap. There can be no last non-human because his child is the same as he is, and there can be no first human because her parent is the same as she is. Two true sentences, and between them, no room on the table for the single card we went hunting for. If that still smells like a word game, nature has built you a working model you can walk around in real space instead of deep time. Biologists call them ring species. Picture a band of salamanders living around the rim of one long valley. Move along the rim, and each population happily breeds with its neighbors. This group with the next, the whole way around the loop. But follow the ring until the two ends curve back and meet on the far side, and those two end populations, now standing shoulder to shoulder, barely interbreed if at all. Walk the chain, one species the entire way. Stare at the join, two species. Same animals, same instant, and the only thing that changed is where you chose to stand. It's the photo stack laid out in a circle on the ground, daring you to point at the card where salamander A becomes salamander B. So the chain has no crossing. The logic forbids a first one. The salamanders prove it with their own bodies. And yet, open any textbook on human origins and there we sit. Filed under a tidy Latin name, handed a birthday measured in years. Somebody drew that line. If the chain of parents and children holds no line at all, then the one printed in the book didn't come up out of biology. It came from a human hand, holding a pencil, making a call. So who drew it, where exactly did they set it down, and what on earth gave them the right? The honest answer is almost funny. A person drew it. Several people, in fact, sitting in rooms, holding old bones, agreeing among themselves where one name should stop and the next should start. And they were not hiding it. There's a technical term for exactly this kind of line, and it gives the whole game away. It's called a chronospecies. When a single lineage slowly transforms through time, paleontologists chop the continuum into named segments, and each segment is a chronospecies, a species defined not by a wall between it and its neighbors, but simply by its slice of time. And the textbooks admit the awkward part outright. Where you make the cut is a matter of convention. The fossil record is a film running for a couple of million years, and naming species means freezing a frame, declaring everything before it one creature and everything after it another. The boundary is drawn for our convenience, so that scientists have words to argue with. It is not a seam that nature left lying in the rock. You already trust this logic in your own life, you just never call it by name. We slice one unbroken human lifespan into child, teenager, adult, and nobody pretends there's a biological midnight when a 17-year-old's body becomes an adult's. We settled on 18, so the paperwork has somewhere to land. A chronospecies is that same move, stretched across the million-year life of a whole lineage. Now you'd be forgiven for assuming our own kind is the grand exception. Surely Homo sapiens, of all the creatures in the catalog, gets a clean opening date. We're the ones writing the book. And the answer, once you go to the bones, is a flat and slightly embarrassing no. Our origin smears worse than almost anything. Take the bones from a Moroccan site called Jebel Irhoud. They were pulled out of the ground back in the 1960s and filed for decades as fairly recent embryo, something Neanderthalish, a few tens of thousands of years old. Then a team working out of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology went back, redated the site, and re-examined the skulls, publishing the result around 2017. The number that came back was close to 300,000 years, far older than anyone had penciled in, and they argued these were early Homo sapiens. But the strangest thing was the shape. The face was startlingly like yours, flat, tucked, modern. The brain case behind it was long and low and old-fashioned, the skull of something more ancient. Modern in front, archaic in back. A mosaic, not a finished human. That redating did something larger than age a few skulls. It helped shove the whole story away from one tidy East African cradle and toward a process that seems to have been simmering across the entire continent at once. And it isn't one odd fossil. Push east into Africa, and you meet more early members of the club, the remains from Homo kibish and Florisbad, each one modern in some features and archaic in others, scattered across a couple 100,000 years and a whole continent. No single birthplace, no single birthday, just a blurry zone smeared over deep time and a landmass. And the blur doesn't even halt at the outline of the skull. Track the shape of the brain case itself, the way researchers do by measuring fossil after fossil, and you find it kept rounding toward today's globe-like form for an enormous stretch after faces like the one at Jebel Irhoud already looked modern. The brain quietly reorganized across thousands of generations. No announcement, no threshold, no single morning when it became the brain you are using to follow this sentence. So when exactly did sapiens begin? The maddening, honest answer is that it depends entirely on which feature you insist on. Demand a high-rounded skull and you get one date. Demand a proper chin and you get another. Demand a specific package of genes, and you slide somewhere else again. The window you'll see quoted, very roughly 200 to 300,000 years ago, isn't a measurement. It's a confession that there is no single moment to measure. Chris Stringer and others who spend their lives on the origin of our species say it plainly. Sapiens blurs at its own beginning. The line in the textbook was always pencil. We drew it across a smear lightly, so we'd have somewhere to file ourselves under a name. But watch the quiet assumption we've been leaning on this entire time. You and I both. We've been picturing one rope of ancestry, a single continuous line running back through the dark, and complaining only that we can't find the knot that marks its start. We've been hunting for the beginning of one thread. The most unsettling thing genetics has dragged into the light in the last few years is that the rope itself is a story we told ourselves. There was never one line to cut. And once you see what was actually back there instead, the question doesn't just lose its answer. It loses its shape. So picture the rope one more time and then let it fray. For most of the last century, the family portrait had a single trunk. One ancestral population, somewhere in Africa, that gradually became us. A clean stem with a few branches off the side. In 2025, a group of geneticists at Cambridge, Cousins, Durban, and colleagues, writing in the journal Nature Genetics, sat down with the genomes of people alive today and tried to reverse engineer the shape of that stem. The math refused to give them one. The pattern written into living DNA fit better if our deep ancestry came from not one but at least two populations that had split apart somewhere over 1 million years ago, drifted separately for an immense stretch, and then, long after, flowed back together and fused into the ancestry every one of us now carries. I want to be careful here because this is fresh work and still being argued over. Treat it as a leading current finding, not a closed case. But if it holds, it quietly redraws the diagram. The base of our tree isn't a trunk at all. It's a braided river, channels peeling apart, wandering the floodplain on their own for ages, then rejoining downstream. There is no founding spring. Ask where the river started, and it just shows you more channels. And the braiding didn't stop down in deep prehistory. Come forward, and our line keeps meeting others. In Europe and Western Asia, there were the Neanderthals. Further east, known mostly from a fingertip bone and a couple of teeth pulled out of a single Siberian cave, were the Denisovans. And the eerie part is that we met them in the genome before we ever met them in the ground. Around 2010, a scrap of finger bone went into a sequencer, and the DNA that came back belonged to no human group anyone had ever cataloged. A whole population of people, named and recognized by science, conjured out of one young girl's finger bone. No skull, no skeleton, just the code. We'd shared a last common ancestor with these cousins something like 400 to 700,000 years ago, gone our separate ways, and then, when our ancestors spread out of Africa, met them again. And we did what humans do. We had children together. The proof isn't in the bones, it's in you. When Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute managed to read DNA straight out of those ancient fossils, they found the unmistakable signature of those encounters stitched into modern genomes. Nearly everyone alive today carries a small but real fraction of Neanderthal DNA. Even people whose ancestry never left Africa turned out, recently, to carry a sliver of it. Many people across Asia and the Pacific carry Denisovan stretches layered on top. The finish line of becoming human wasn't a lone runner breasting a tape. It was a confluence. Several kinds of human flowing together, trading genes right up to the end. And those borrowed stretches of DNA aren't dead weight rattling around inside you. Some of them work for a living. A number of Neanderthal variants tune the modern immune system, the speed and shape of how your body lunges at a new infection. And the gene that lets people on the Tibetan plateau live and labor in thin mountain air, where a lowlander would be gasping, appears to have come straight from Denisovans, a survival trick handed across the species line and still keeping people alive at altitude today. The other kinds of human didn't simply brush past us on their way to extinction. Pieces of them are load-bearing walls in the body you're using to read this. So the first human doesn't merely lack a birthday, it lacks a bloodline to be born into. You are not the tip of one long line, you are the place where several lines happen, for now to meet. Part Neanderthal, part Denisovan, part something a brand new model is still struggling to name. The most ordinary human alive is a crossroads wearing a face. And once you've spotted one line that was never really there, you start catching them everywhere. The point where a dialect quietly becomes a separate language. The day a stream becomes a river, a hill becomes a mountain, a cluster of houses becomes a town. The blur between awake and asleep that you cross every single night without once feeling the threshold. We paint hard edges onto soft gradients constantly, just to have something to grip. So let me ask you something before we land this. What's one line in your own life, a category, a label, a before and after that you've always treated as a wall and might turn out to be a slope? Drop it in the comments. I actually read them. And if you like having the solid ground pulled out from under you this gently, stick around. Subscribing is what keeps these threads coming. Because we've now spent 4 chapters dissolving things. No first human, no clean species. No single line. Which leaves one obvious, slightly panicked question hanging in the air. If human has no first member, no sharp edge, and no single source, is the word simply empty? A label for a fog? It is not. It points at something completely real. And in the last few minutes, I want to hand the word back to you intact and show you what it actually makes you, sitting right there at this one frame of a film that has never stopped rolling. Take the word back then, and notice it weighs more than the fog ever let on. Human is real. It simply isn't a starting line. It's a sunset. Step outside this evening and try to catch the exact instant day becomes night. You can't. There's no frame where the sky flips over. There's afternoon, then a long amber slide, then a deepening blue, and then, undeniably, night. Real night. Dark and complete. Nothing else you'd think to call it. The night isn't an illusion just because it had no opening second. It's a true thing with a soft edge. And look at what we do to that soft edge anyway. We carve it up. We invented civil twilight, nautical twilight, astronomical twilight, 3 separate official borders sliced into one slow fade, each a number settled by committee so that sailors and courts and almanacs have something firm to point at. That's the chronospecies trick again, drawn across the sky. We cannot help fencing a gradient. Human is that fade, only stretched across a few 100,000 years instead of one evening. And the softness runs deeper than bones. The archaeologist Colin Renfrew gave one corner of this a name back in the 1990s, the sapient paradox. The puzzle goes like this. People with fully modern bodies and modern-sized brains were walking the earth for something on the order of 100,000 years or more before the things we picture as acting human, crowded settlements, farming, the eruption of symbols and trade and towns, suddenly sped up only around 10,000 years ago. And even that surge isn't clean at its base. Scattered sparks, a chunk of ochre scored with a deliberate crosshatch, a handful of pierced shell beads, flicker on across Africa tens of thousands of years before the real blaze, as if the behavior itself came up on a dimmer rather than snapping on with a switch. For most of our run, we were anatomically us and behaviorally something quieter. Even behaving like a human, it turns out, comes with no switch to flip. There was no morning when someone woke up modern. Where exactly that long gap comes from is still argued over, but the lack of a single on switch isn't. Where does all of this leave you? Somewhere stranger, and I think far better than where we began. Because the lesson hiding under the whole journey is this. Where you draw the line called human depends entirely on what you choose to weigh. The shape of a skull hands you one date. The genes in a cell hand you another. The symbols scratched on a cave wall hand you a third. They don't agree, and the standing temptation is to treat that as a problem somebody will finally solve with a better fossil. It isn't a problem. The disagreement is the answer. The line keeps sliding because there is no line, only a gradient we keep trying to fence. Let me say the whole of it once, plainly, now that you've walked the length of it. There was no first human, and there could not have been one. Every creature standing in your ancestry was the same species as its parents and the same species as its children. The change is utterly real. A fish at one end, you at the other, yet it moves too slowly to ever finish on a single birthday, so no parent ever handed a brand new kind of creature into the world. Human is a name we paint, after the fact, onto a smooth and unbroken slope, exactly the way we call one stretch of a sunset night. Run the film backward and you will never, not once, catch a non-human giving birth to a human. You will find 100,000 generations of change too small to see. The species feels like a hard, bright category only because we happen to stand at one end of it, looking back down the hill. But the line we keep imagining was never crossed by anyone because it was never there to cross. And that changes what you are. You are not descended from the first human. There is no ancestor in that endless stack you could kneel in front of and call the origin, the source, the one it all began with. What you are instead is the current edge. The newest frame of a film that started rolling long before there were eyes to watch it and has not paused once since, running up through the fish, through the things that hauled themselves out of the water, through 100,000 mothers holding babies in the dark, arriving for this single flicker at you. You are not the end of the line either. There is no end. Your own children, if you have them, are the next frame already. A hair different, already drifting onward without a sound. The next time someone asks who the first human was, you'll be holding the most honest and most vertiginous answer there wasn't one. There's only the long, unbroken slide, and you tonight briefly at the front of it. If you'd sooner be handed the whole slope than sold a tidy starting line, stay close. We'll keep working threads like this one loose, one frame at a time. Because the film hasn't stopped. You're in it right now. And somewhere just ahead of you, far too slowly to feel, the next frame is already being born.